The Texas Senate approved $3 billion in funding for dementia research. A look at where the money will go. A bill criminalizing being transgender is introduced. The proposal and the reactions. A digital currency comeback. Texas could soon have its own Bitcoin reserve. Learn more about what that means and what the implications are. All of this coming up on Tower Talks. Good evening and welcome to Tower Talks, the show where we take a closer look at the stories affecting Texans, Austinites, and students right here at the UT Austin. I'm Justin Doud, and tonight we have a live interview lined up for you to talk about water policy in Texas. But before we get into that, reporter Kai Fong and I attended the Texas Capitol's annual Water Day. Kai, how are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty good. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, thank you for coming out.
Last Monday, the Texas Water Foundation hosted Water Day, which included panels and keynote speakers representing policies and solutions for Texas's growing water shortage. Notable organizations and names included L'Oreal Stepney, chairwoman of the Texas Water Development Board, who went viral last week for an exchange with Representative Brian Harrison and groups like 2036 and the Texas Water Association. Multiple pieces of legislation have been filed for water initiatives and investments this session, and Governor Abbott declared an emergency item.
Yeah, absolutely. Seeing the groups like Texas 2036 out there was really impactful, and I feel like they shared a lot of information. Can you tell us a little bit more about what the purpose of Water Day is and why it's held at the Capitol instead of somewhere else?
Yeah, so Water Day is an event that's held every legislative session meant to inform legislatures about the state of water and the water crisis in Texas and to urge them to take action while in session in pursuit of solutions to the issue. Advocacy organizations and individuals involved with water-related advocacy and solutions on the ground gather at the Capitol and talk about whatever they believe the most pressing and useful solution is, whether that's an investment in funding sources for infrastructure, updates, or expansions to the state's access for water sources, among others.
Right, it's about access to legislators and those in the position to implement structural change as it relates to the issue. So you mentioned Chairwoman Stepney's exchange with Rep. Harrison the week before Water Day. Can you expand on that a little and what happened there?
Sure, Justin. The Appropriations Subcommittee that Harrison is seated on held a hearing to review the budget requests of state agencies before the passage of a budget this session. Stepney, a black woman, testified before the committee on behalf of the Texas Water Developmental Board about the agency's request for further investment. During the hearing, Harrison redirected the line of questioning toward the board's hiring policies, where he questioned Stepney and Edna Johnson, another black official with the board, on the agency's use of diversity, equity, and inclusion practices. Representative Nicole Collier, another member of the subcommittee, defended Stepney and her credentials and qualifications, as did Representative Armando Wally, the subcommittee's chair. Stepney defended her own qualifications as an engineer with multiple degrees from UT and someone with vast experience in the field as tears fell. The whole interaction drew comments in support of Stepney, an Abbott appointee, from the Lieutenant Governor, the Governor, and the Speaker of the House, Dustin Burrows, on X. Meanwhile, Harrison defended his line of questioning. None of the big three commented on Harrison's testimony, focusing their remarks on Stepney's qualifications.
Yeah, it sounds like Stepney was widely supported. What was the reaction to her speech on Water Day?
Stepney was welcomed with open arms and received a standing ovation from the room after her remarks in front of a partisan group of attendees. I'd say overall it was a very supportive environment, and she reiterated her thanks for that support.
Absolutely. Well, Kai, it sounds like it was a very informative event. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Justin.
Yeah. Coming up, we have a guest from the Environmental Defense Fund here to talk about water policy. Stay tuned. Tower Talks will be right back.
13 of the 48 club sports offered by the university now require students to submit proof of sex assigned at birth.
I know deep down they would probably want to stay with the university.
No way in hell anybody's going to tell my daughters what to do with their bodies.
This state is one of the worst in child education.
We can't take it anymore, seeing those scenes.
Going to Hillel on Friday night, all my family members kept texting me not to go.
There's a huge housing crisis in Austin. Do you have a plan in place to address this issue? Determined to start your day well? We're up bright and early. From the enriching local stories to the weather forecast later in the day. Rain or shine, at Good Morning Longhorns, we got you covered. Comprised of a studious reporting staff going lengths to get that scoop, and a talented technical team to enhance your screen visually. As a fellow Longhorn, your mornings are better with us. So start your day the Vivo way. Good Morning Longhorns, Wednesdays at 7 a.m. Central Time on TSTV.
Welcome back to Tower Talks. Tonight, we have Vanessa Puig-Williams with us. Vanessa is the Senior Director of the Climate Resilience Water Program at the Environmental Defense Fund. So as the Senior Director, she leads EDF's efforts to advance sustainable groundwater management in Texas and beyond. Vanessa joined EDF in 2020, bringing in more than a decade of experience working to protect critical groundwater resources in Texas and around the country. So Vanessa, can you start off by just walking me through a little bit about what the Environmental Defense Fund does and then what the goal of the Texas Water Program, which you lead, is?
Sure. So most of our work at Environmental Defense Fund in our water program, because EDF is a huge nonprofit that's working to address a lot of climate-related issues across the globe. But in our water program, our focus is on really advancing more proactive groundwater management. We think that groundwater underpins our water supply, not just in Texas, but across the West. It provides drinking water to rural communities. It's often the largest source of water for irrigation needs. And it also provides critical flows to our surface water resources. So we think that sound management of our water supplies really starts with managing groundwater proactively. So that's a focus of our work across the program.
So what do you think the threats to groundwater in Texas are? I know that here in Austin we're fed quite a lot by the Edwards Aquifer. Can you talk a little bit about what threats could be posed to groundwater across the state?
Yeah, I think the threats to groundwater are really no different than the threats that we also see to surface water. It's just that with groundwater we don't see those impacts as quickly, so it can make figuring out how to address those challenges a little more tricky. But the threats are twofold. The first is from the population growth that we're seeing in Texas, with over 1,200 to 1,300 people moving to Texas a day, and our population is supposed to triple by the end of the century. And then, of course, drought. I think a lot of people think drought is going to end, and it feels like maybe it does sometimes when we get a little bit of rain, but really our state as a whole is becoming more arid. And so that not only affects our rivers and streams, which we can see, but it's affecting the recharge to our aquifers. So when you have communities or farmers who are drilling wells, they're often, having trouble reaching those aquifer levels because they're declining. And that also, of course, as I had mentioned previously, because of the connection between groundwater and surface water, that has an impact to our rivers as well. So really, I think both the increased demand for water and then the impact that the fact that it's not raining as much is having on our water sources is affecting our groundwater supplies and surface water supplies.
Right, so it kind of starts at groundwater, but it it goes through kind of every aspect of access that people have.
That's a good way to look at it.
So can you talk a little bit about your experience before EDF, kind of both how you got into water and water advocacy? I feel like that's kind of a unique career choice.
Yeah. So, well, I also am a lawyer. I didn't mention that. Maybe didn't want to, but sure. But I knew that I wanted to go to law school and study, environmental regulation and natural resource policy. So that's always just been a passion of mine. But I worked for the Attorney General's office here in Texas doing environmental regulation for several years. But I think it was actually during the 2011 drought when the city of Austin's water supply was really at risk that I began taking a closer look at what water policy initiatives were in Texas and what that meant for our water supplies. And I started doing research and writing, and I actually helped to form a nonprofit in the Hill Country that was working on supporting local communities and landowners in the area who were concerned about their groundwater resources that were under threat from large groundwater export projects that were coming in the area near Wimberley. And so that kind of thrust me into, the groundwater space. But through that, I realized that I actually liked the policy piece of it better than the litigation. Because I think when it comes to water policy, because everybody needs water, obviously, and we need it for different reasons, that you have to come together and work. Most of the state's water policy has been developed bottom up. It's been consensus-based from a variety of different stakeholders coming to the table to really figure out, what's best for Texas.
Right. And so for people, especially on campus that might not be as familiar with the 2011 drought and kind of how impactful that was for Texas and how widespread it was, can you talk a little bit about what things were like when that drought hit?
Well, I think it was really it's our new drought of record. The previous one was from the 1950s, and I remember thinking, I had very young boys at that time, and I remember thinking, oh my God, I don't know if they remember what rain looks like, and I remember when it finally rained and we all just ran out on our front porch, and I heard stories about farmers, doing the same in the 50s once that drought finally broke. But in Austin, our single water source, which is the Colorado River, was precariously low, and across the state it was just dire. But we've seen conditions very similar to that, happen again and again. If you look at the drought monitor maps for for Texas and looking at central Austin, there's just this constant red bullseye that keeps waxing and waning, but it's always there. It's it feels like sometimes like a cancer that just isn't going away. It's ever present. So that's why I think that we almost need to get away from the terminology of drought, because I think people associate that with an end to it, and really we're just becoming a drier state.
Right. With
periods of heavy rain in between.
Yeah, it's not so much kind of something that's temporary as something that's going to be lasting. We need to learn how to adapt around it, is kind of what you're talking about.
That's correct, yes.
So for viewers that don't necessarily follow environmental issues or policy in Texas, can you dive a little into kind of what the state of water is currently around the state, not just in Austin, and why there's been so much discussion around it in Texas politics lately?
Well, we have a variety of very large challenges across the state when it comes to our water supplies. And I mentioned, the population growth and the drought that's kind of driving the urgency around that. But we're facing, water shortages across the state, both from, our surface water resources and groundwater. There's demands that are not going to be met. We have severe water infrastructure needs, both in urban areas and in rural communities. I think Texas 2036 did an analysis that has said that we have almost up to $150 billion worth of infrastructure needs that the state needs to invest in. We have leaking and failing infrastructure, again, both in urban and rural communities, that needs to be addressed, because that's essentially water that would otherwise be utilized. And we have workforce issues in Texas. That's another big challenge that we have. We have aging infrastructure. We also have aging workforce, and just sort of a lack of workforce altogether. So those are sort of like the major themes, I think, that the legislature is really trying to grapple with, is like, how can we develop new water supplies for the state? How can we address this failing and deteriorating infrastructure that we have?
I talked to someone from Texas 2036 earlier today, and they kind of underpinned the same thing in terms of the workforce shortage. It seems like it's a very stable career choice, right? I mean, you're always going to need water, and the way that the person from Texas 2036 put it was that it was recession-proof in a way, because there's kind of a consistency there that a lot of areas don't necessarily have, but there seems to be kind of a lack of desire to go into that field, or a lack of understanding about the full potential that there is for career opportunities there. So there's a water shortage in Texas, or at least a deterioration in access. What are the implications of that on daily life for people in urban areas, like Austin, but also for rural areas?
Well, I think that it's the rural areas that are really feeling that, and that's, individual landowners who have their own well that they rely on for their drinking water, who, it might actually run dry at some point, or they wake up and they're not getting water out of the tap, and it's because aquifer levels have declined, and maybe where they have the pump in their well now needs to be lowered, and so there's a cost associated with that, lowering that pump. Maybe at some point levels will have fallen so much that they even have to drill a new well. So I think rural landowners are going to feel the brunt much more quickly than we will in urban areas. And I mean, I know that even in farmers are obviously, experiencing that too. Around Lubbock, there's been a lot of cotton that's kind of had to be taken out of production because of a lack of water, and even outside of groundwater, just with surface water, we've seen along in the valley with the sugarcane industry going out of business due to lack of water from the Rio Grande. So in urban areas, I think we are a little more insulated from that. We tend to experience water challenges more when we have infrastructure issues, like when we have a freeze and that causes pipes to break, or maybe there's a water quality issue, and so we go on boil water notices. And I would say also that rural communities have to deal with that too. But I think larger urban areas, just because of the resources that they have, are able to look longer term about where their future water supplies are going to be coming from, and so that's really kind of making them more adaptive to the changes and the shortages that we're going to see. Right, and those smaller communities don't have the same resources to kind of take as drastic action. So you talked about the agriculture industry and how it could be impacted. Can you talk a little bit about the economic impact that could have? I feel like a lot of people hear about the solutions to water issues, which we'll get into soon, but one of the biggest concerns that they have is the cost, right? They look at those solutions and they see dollar signs. I feel like it's also worth talking about what not pursuing those solutions, what effect that will have on the economy. Just kind of restated, what implications would it have on the agriculture economy in Texas? Well, I mean, agriculture is a huge piece of our economy in Texas, and I think, as I mentioned, groundwater supplies a significant portion of that. I think upwards of 80% of the water that's used by irrigation in Texas is groundwater, and that is because groundwater is privately owned, and so the farmers that are using that water are pumping their own water, so there is actually not a significant cost for them for the water that they're using. Now, many farmers are investing in irrigation efficiency that does have a cost, But if we continue to see these declines in groundwater, if we're not actually doing the things that we need to in terms of understanding how to manage it by investing in the data and science that informs decision making, and we continue to see these declines, I mean, that will mean that our farming industry is going to have to look at alternative sources of water, and that there will be a cost for that, and I imagine that cost would be passed on to consumers. So I think the cheapest water is the water that we already have, and so if we're trying to think about how we can be economical about it, then we need to first look at solutions that really involve conserving and more efficiently managing that water.
Right. So Texas is no stranger to these conditions, both in urban areas and in rural areas, and to a lack of water. But it seems like there's been a lot of conversation around it in this legislative session specifically. So why do you think 2025 is kind of the moment that that people are saying this is the time to take action?
Well, there was a lot of conversation last session about it, and the legislature ended up, passing historic policies, and the voters approved $1 billion of funding that went to support investments in water infrastructure and new water supplies. But that was just a drop in the bucket, and I think everybody knew that we needed to come back for more. And so we still have a historic surplus in the state, and I think there's been some conversation about that might not be the case next session. So I think, kind of recognizing the urgency around our water supply shortages, the increasing population growth that we're having, plus the fact that we have funding now to actually be able to make these generational investments, really has led up to this being the pivotal moment for our state.
Right, and I'm going to assume that the drop in the bucket wasn't a pun, that you didn't intend for that.
We like to make water puns in the water world.
Right. Well, after our break, we will continue our discussion about the future of water policy in Texas. Tower Talks will be right back.
Thirteen of the 48 club sports offered by the university now require students to submit proof of sex assigned at birth.
I know deep down they would probably want to stay with the university.
No way in hell anybody's going to tell my daughters what to do with their bodies.
This state is one of the worst in child education.
We can't take it anymore seeing those scenes.
Going to Hillel on Friday night, all my family members kept texting me not to go.
There's a huge housing crisis in Austin. Do you have a plan in place to address this issue? Determined to start your day well? We're up bright and early. From the enriching local stories to the weather forecast later in the day. Rain or shine, at Good Morning Longhorns, we got you covered. Comprised of a studious reporting staff going lengths to get that scoop, and a talented technical team to enhance your screen visually. As a fellow Longhorn, your mornings are better with us. So start your day the Vivo way. Good Morning Longhorns, Wednesdays at 7 a.m. Central Time on TSTV.
Welcome back to Tower Talks. We're going to keep diving in on water policy in Texas, but I want to focus a little bit more on the legislature and kind of the actions that the legislature is looking to take this session. So this session, Governor Abbott declared water as an emergency item in the Texas legislature. Why do you think that was done now? You kind of addressed it with the budget surplus a little bit, but more importantly, how can a move like that motivate action from the legislature?
Well, when the governor declares something an emergency item, it really makes it a priority piece of legislation that helps it kind of move through the process. And I think the governor was reacting to the reality that we're seeing with all of our growth and the declines in our water supply and concern over what that means for industry, what that means for the Texas economy.
Right. In the same vein, can you talk a little bit about, and this is a broad question, but what action is being taken in the legislature? Have there been any bills already filed? I know some were filed last week. Any that you're keeping an eye on and that you have kind of hope for moving forward in the session?
Yeah, there's been actually lots of water bills, but I think the big ones right now that most people are watching are the Senate and House versions that would basically, funnel significant amounts of money, billions of dollars towards water infrastructure and new water supply planning. And so the conversation is centered around the need to do like a one-time infusion of funding. And Senator Perry from Lubbock, Chairman Charles Perry, has been sort of the biggest champion for that. He was the one that really, worked on the issue last session. And so, he's been a great champion to kind of, I think, bring others in the fold on this issue. And so we're also now seeing the House, too, have their own piece of legislation as well. So, there's legislation that really directs the money, that appropriates the money, and then there's legislation that we've seen the House file, not yet on the Senate side, that really talks about like how that money is going to be utilized. But, I think in general, everyone recognizes that there's a need to have large generational investments to address the water infrastructure needs that the state has, both in urban and rural communities, and then also be looking at, how we can develop new water sources for the state as well.
Right. And when I'm referring to Senator Perry, I always call him the water man. That's kind of how I go by.
I haven't heard that one yet.
Yeah, he's kind of the number one source in the legislature. So when you talk about funds being kind of focused on these new water sources, but then also on repairs to infrastructure, can you expand a little bit on where that would take effect most, kind of specifically infrastructure repair? Where are representatives and senators looking for to invest this money around the state?
Well, so last session when the legislature, appropriated $1 billion, there was an emphasis on that funding going to support rural communities. And the Water Development Board, which is the agency that received that funding and has, taken it and spread it throughout their programs, followed through on that. And I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but, millions of dollars has gone to address infrastructure needs for rural communities. So I think that will remain a priority, but I know that there is also, a priority that needs to remain for urban areas too in this coming legislative session, which also have huge water needs. So I think there's just maybe like an interest to kind of spread the love a little bit this time around. I know that I've heard many stakeholders mention that. And so, that infrastructure funding is to address the leaky pipes, to, expand the infrastructure where needed. Whereas when we're talking about like new water supply or alternative water supply, maybe is another way that you can describe it. It's like how we diversify our water portfolio, which, as I had mentioned earlier, is kind of a privilege that urban centers are able to finance. But, rural areas, because they're, wholly reliant on groundwater, there may be cases where we need to look at bringing in alternative water supplies to support a rural community. And so, I think figuring out what the best solution is something that I think those communities need to be involved in as well. I had a colleague tell me that water management and planning in Texas is all about location, location, location. It's like similar to when you're buying a house. We can't have a one-size-fits-all solution because it's going to be different depending on the community's needs and like the realities of the water supplies that are available.
Right. And do you feel like a one-time surge in funding is the best path to go forward, or do you feel like it should be kind of a more concentrated long-term investment?
Yeah. So I should have mentioned that's the two different buckets. There's
Gotcha.
a dedicated funding to kind of infuse the programs, and then there is the dedicated funding long term. So similar to how we would fund roads, which is obviously our roads are important pieces of infrastructure. Water is an important piece of infrastructure in the state, and so rather than having to come back like every few sessions and have more money that we need to be asking for to address like these challenges that are going to always exist on some level, having that funding in place year in and year out is something that I think a lot of people have been arguing is needed for quite some time, and the legislature, thanks to Senator Perry's efforts, is finally listening.
Right. And this is kind of getting into the weeds logistically, but I'm just curious. When you talk about kind of finding sources for water elsewhere,
Mm-hmm.
what does that look like? I mean, where do you look for potential water sources? Is it surrounding states? I mean, what's the kind of possibility there?
Well, there's always been, I think, an idea that we can get water from states to our east that have more of it. But again, location, location, location. So I think in some cases, looking at aquifer storage and recovery, which is where you actually take surplus flood waters, or in some cases you could even do like treated wastewater, and you store it underground so it's not evaporating, like we're seeing with reservoirs that have much higher evaporation rate. That's something that cities are looking at. Brackish groundwater, which is the very deep layers of aquifers where the water is really salty, could also be a potential source for communities. But and the Water Development Board has done a lot of analysis on what is available for Texas to look at in terms of developing that supply. But we also have to recognize that that's not a sustainable source of water in the future. That is, brackish groundwater does not recharge. It's a finite supply. So if we're going to be, building communities and planning for growth based on that, we need to be aware that, it may not be here forever. There's also, seawater desalination is another big new source of water that the coastal part of our state is looking at right now to serve industry and potentially communities, and it might very well be something that we need to look at more widespread for the state. But there are environmental issues with it when that water is treated and the salts are removed. That brine has to be disposed of somewhere, and there isn't a requirement right now in the state for it to be taken offshore, and so it can be disposed of kind of within our bays and estuaries, and there's a lot of controversy over whether that's actually going to be safe. We have some really amazing coastal habitats and ecosystems that I know everybody wants to protect. I think it's just a different opinion on like what those standards need to look like.
Right, what it looks like in practice. And that kind of leads me really well into a point that I wanted to talk about, which is Corpus Christi specifically, right? That's an area that's looking at desalination pretty heavily as a possibility. They've begun investments in it, and they are also kind of really affected by that industry that you're talking about, the investment industry. So a major point of contention in areas like that is kind of trying to find the balance between the need for water in industry and the role that that industry plays in the economy, both locally and in the state, but also the need for water in residential areas, which can kind of be shorted by the excessive water use of those industries. And it also comes down to the fact that a lot of those industries aren't subject to the same regulations that are put in place when a drought warning or something like that is put in place in a local area. So in Corpus, that balance has been kind of hard to find in the midst of the shortage that they've been in since 2022 and a growth in industry investment around the Bay. So how do you advise people to go about finding the balance between those two needs?
I don't know if I have the answer. All I can say is that I think it really comes down to involving as many different people who are impacted in the decisions. And I think that that's something that we need to do a better job across the state, particularly like on these local challenges like this. Everybody needs to have a seat at the table, and how the water supply in that area is going to be planned for in the future. And we do have, our regional water planning and state water planning process, but a lot of the projects that are developed are not always developed as part of that planning process. And so, I think there still needs to be conversations had with all the people who are impacted by those decisions,
right,
to find that balance, because they're the ones that are going to be impacted.
Right. So in Texas, some estimates have said that the state could run out of water in as little as 5 years for daily use. So in the opinion of the Environmental Defense Fund, what are the most crucial policy decisions that need to be made now before anything else?
So, we are supportive of the dedicated funding to, address our water infrastructure needs and to be looking where, we need to develop new water supply. That's, I think, an extremely important policy that we support. But while we're doing that, we also need to be looking at how we manage our existing supplies. And that, to me, means, really continuing to invest in conservation as well. To invest in nature, because oftentimes our natural infrastructure can be way more cost effective at conserving water and recharging our aquifers and cleaning our water, and we don't often, I think, go there first in Texas. We like to look at kind of the pipes first before we look at the plants. And I think that we need to be investing in our understanding of our water resources, particularly groundwater, because as I had mentioned earlier, it really underpins our whole water supply. Aquifers are infrastructure, and so you might have heard me say that at Texas Water Day. And for rural communities, it's their only source of water. That well that they're pumping groundwater from is infrastructure. And so we don't know a lot still about aquifers, which is kind of amazing to me. In 2025 we know a lot more than we used to, but there are still a lot of questions that are hard to answer when why is an aquifer declining? Like, is it because of groundwater pumping? Is it because of drought? Where? Can a groundwater conservation district, which are these state entities, these local entities that manage groundwater, can they allow for more pumping here? Where should they limit it? Those are difficult questions because aquifers are kind of complex, and so we need to be investing in our understanding of that, and funding more data and funding more studies that help inform decision making. And that's an inexpensive thing compared to the billions of dollars that we also need to be investing in sort of more traditional infrastructure and water supply. But it's needed, and it doesn't have to be at the expense. Like, I think we need to be doing all of these things in order to really shore up our water supplies.
I feel like a lot of people talk about pipe repair. And it's like that's crucial, that's important, but so is having an understanding of the science behind everything, so that you can know where to invest in, where the resources should go, because you don't want to spend all of this money only for it not to be the most effective or cost-effective solution.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've heard Senator Perry say, like, when industry is coming to Texas, they're not asking if their pipes are leaking, they're asking if there's water in the pipes. And so, I think we don't want to be investing in building, billions of dollars worth of infrastructure if we don't actually know that there's going to be water there to, flow through it.
Right. So kind of looking forward and looking into the future, we know that there are policies that are hopefully going to be advanced in the legislature this session, that are hopefully going to have a positive impact on the state of water in Texas. Outside of the legislature, what are independent groups like the Environmental Defense Fund doing to try and help the situation? What advocacy is going into it, and where are your efforts being concentrated?
Well, actually right now they're being concentrated in the legislature.
Sure.
But we have our own initiative that are part of a coalition of many organizations that are supporting a bill that Representative Harris has filed that would create a new program at the Water Development Board. It would be a grant program for groundwater conservation districts to apply to fund the data and studies that they need to better, manage groundwater levels. Because even though we have a preference in Texas for local management of groundwater, the state does not really support that management, on the ground management. And so there's many groundwater districts that just don't have the resources to do that. There's, I think, 68% of the groundwater districts in Texas have budgets under $500,000. So that is not enough money to be able to do the robust science that they need to make those decisions, and to understand how to manage and plan, into the future. And so that's something that this bill would address, and it's supported by a wide range of organizations, from the agricultural sector to kind of rural water systems, to groups like Texas 2036 that are kind of looking at the whole statewide picture. So that has been a huge effort of ours, in the legislature, but then even outside, just raising awareness for the need to have sound and proactive management of groundwater in Texas.
Right. And I think that Rep. Harris is kind of becoming Senator Perry's counterpart in the House, in terms of water investment. So we are about out of time. Is there anything else that you want to add in terms of what EDF is doing, or what needs to be done in the state?
Well, I want first thank you for having me on, and I'm excited that y'all are covering this issue. I think going back to the workforce issue, I think having students pay attention to this and, study water resource management, whatever it is that you want to study, if it can lead you to a career in water, I think is important because, as I'd mentioned, we're seeing a real need for that in the state. So, yeah, thank you very much.
Absolutely. And everybody in the newsroom will tell you that I haven't shut up about water for weeks. So I've been very excited to get to expand on this.
I mean, this might be your next career if you're not going to be in journalism.
We'll see what happens. Well, thank you to our wonderful panelists. We really appreciate you coming on. I recently spoke with Jeremy Mazur, the Director of Infrastructure and Natural Resources Policy with Texas 2036. Jeremy works directly with state and legislative leaders on policy changes needed for Texas's energy and water future. Let's go ahead and take a look at that conversation.
The big policy solution on the legislature's table for the 2025 session all boils down to water infrastructure funding. When we look at the data, we see that the state will need to spend at least $150 billion in the coming decades on expanding and diversifying our water supply portfolio, plus also fixing aging, deteriorating drinking water and wastewater systems that are becoming a liability to the communities that they serve. And so the big issue, the big question in front of the legislature this session is, what is a sustainable financial strategy that the state can adopt to help fix these issues in the long run.
Right. So I feel like deteriorating infrastructure is kind of self-explanatory. People generally understand that. But when you talk about expanding a portfolio, for people that aren't following the water situation or the legislative priorities, can you talk kind of about what that looks like and what steps Texas would need to take to expand that portfolio?
So we need to be mindful of the fact that Texas is a drought-prone state. If you look throughout our recorded history and even prehistory before Texas became a state, we have endured droughts that have extended for years and even decades, and oftentimes placing our water resources, our rivers, lakes, and reservoirs, as well as our groundwater resources in jeopardy. And so to put it bluntly, droughts do very bad things to our water supplies because they dry them up or they accelerate our use of groundwater resources. The solution to this is to build and develop a broad, diversified water supply portfolio. And that includes some of our traditional water supply technologies, such as reservoirs and groundwater wells. But it also involves quite a bit of innovation and forward thinking, such as using water reuse, water conservation, and even seawater desalination as a way to expand our water supply portfolio and diversify it in order to make it resilient to future drought conditions.
So when we come back, we're going to take a look at some updates with the Texas legislative session. Tower Talks will be right back.
Thirteen of the 48 club sports offered by the university now require students to submit proof of sex assigned at birth.
I know deep down they would probably want to stay with the university.
No way in hell anybody's going to tell my daughters what to do with their bodies.
This state is one of the worst in child education.
We can't take it anymore seeing those scenes.
Going to Hillel on Friday night, all my family members kept texting me not to go.
There's a huge housing crisis in Austin. Do you have a plan in place to address this issue? Determined to start your day well? We're up bright and early. From the enriching local stories to the weather forecast later in the day. Rain or shine, at Good Morning Longhorns, we got you covered. Comprised of a studious reporting staff going lengths to get that scoop, and a talented technical team to enhance your screen visually. As a fellow Longhorn, your mornings are better with us. So start your day the Vivo way. Good Morning Longhorns, Wednesdays at 7 a.m. Central Time on TSTV.
Welcome back to Tower Talks. Now we're going to take a look at the latest with the Texas State Legislature. We have General Reporter Emmy Adams to tell us more. Emmy, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, thank you, Justin.
Yeah.
On March 5th, 2025, the Texas Senate advanced Senate Joint Resolution 3 that would establish the Dementia Prevention and Research Institute of Texas. The bill was introduced by Republican Senator Joan Huffman. The intent of the resolution is to fund $3 billion to attract researchers and physicians who specialize in the field of dementia. The grants will be awarded to projects that focus on addressing the causes, prevention, treatment, and rehabilitation of dementia patients. The resolution also aims to fund the creation of new medicines and facilities to treat dementia patients. Although this resolution focuses on researching dementia, the Institute will research all brain diseases and not just dementia. On the Senate floor before the start of the vote, Senator Huffman said, quote, "I can't think, as a body, as a legislature, that we could make a wiser, more prudent, better investment for the people of Texas and future generations," end quote. The bill passed with an overwhelming 29 yeas and 2 nays. Republican Senator Kelly Hancock, who voted against this legislation, said, quote, "My vote is not a vote of support. It's just a vote of recognizing that we need to focus on other things as a government, and it concerns me as we add some of these on," end quote. The bill now moves to the House, where, if passed, could appear on your November 4th, 2025 ballot. The Texas House of Representatives proposed a bill last week that threatens to charge individuals who identify with a different gender than one assigned at birth. If passed, House Bill 3817 would classify being transgender as gender identity fraud, a state jail felony. State Representative Tom Oliverson defines this concept as, quote, "identifying the person's biological sex as the opposite of the biological sex assigned at birth."
It seems to me like there's a lot going on in the legislature right now. There's a lot happening. I know that a whole host of bills were filed last week, and I think that we're kind of moving forward in the session as we are looking to make kind of advancements in that legislative process. So it seems to me like a lot of those major initiatives that are being pushed by the legislature, by the governor, and by representatives and senators in both chambers are going to be making a lot of advancements in the coming weeks, and that we are going to see quite a lot more unfold. So the first 60 days of the legislature are always kind of lackluster. They're always kind of slow because they can't pass a bill for those few days. However, things are really going to start picking up now. There's 140 days in the legislature, 60 days they can't do anything, so that leaves a really short window of time wherein they're able to actually make advancements in the laws that are being passed. Now, I'm going to go ahead and ask you to kind of expand a little bit more on the bill that you were just talking about. You said that it would apply to those who switch. Could you restate what you were referring to?
Yes. So this bill, if passed, it would charge someone who identifies as transgender with gender identity fraud. This theoretical offense would include anywhere from 180 days to 2 years in jail and up to a $10,000 fine. Stakeholders believe that the likelihood of this bill's passing is low, and the purpose of its proposal may be to shift conversations towards anti-trans views regardless of its approval. Transgender activists strongly disapprove of this proposal, while supporters hope to bring this topic to light. If approved by Governor Greg Abbott, the bill would go into effect on September 1st, 2025. So far, House Bill 3817 does not have any sponsors and has not moved to any committees. Despite its unlikelihood of being approved, this proposal is renewing the ongoing debate between Texas lawmakers and members of the LGBTQ+ community. Callie Butcher, for example, founder of a Dallas law firm that supports the LGBTQ community, argues that bills such as this are in line with a larger political agenda that aims to criminalize members of the community. Since bill filing began in 2024, over 50 pieces of legislation have been filed to restrict the rights of transgender Texans, including the expansion of Senate Bill 14 to ban gender-affirming care for both children and adults. President Trump has been calling for the United States to establish a federal crypto reserve. However, the state of Texas may beat him to the punch. On Thursday, March 6th, the Senate passed Senate Bill 21. Senate Bill 21 would create a Texas Strategic Bitcoin Reserve. According to the bill, the reserve would be controlled by the state comptroller, but it would exist outside of the state treasury. The money for the fund will come from a mix of appropriations from the legislature and from donations. The crypto reserve, if created, would function as another cash reserve for the state, like gold. There is a finite amount of cryptocurrency, such as Bitcoin, available to mine. However, Bitcoin is not a tangible asset. It is either entirely digital. The sponsor of the bill, Republican Senator Charles Schwertner, stated in an interview to KVUE that the reserve serves to to diversify states' finances. However, detractors of the plan have stated that it would be a poor investment because cryptocurrency historically is a volatile asset and the crypto market is extremely vulnerable to price swings. Crypto markets and wallets are also highly susceptible to cyber attacks. Opponents argue that cryptocurrency is decentralized and was meant to exist outside of government control. It is not backed by anything physical, making investing in it a questionable choice. The bill is set to be voted on by the House. A new poll from UT's Texas Politics Project has revealed what topics Texas voters believe are most important. In the poll, voters were asked to show which topics out of 15 issues were of most importance to them, and taking the lead is improving the energy grid at 84%. A tie of 81% follows with lowering the costs of everyday goods and services and state water supply reliability. Reducing property taxes was another important issue for voters at 71%. Governor Abbott has named 3 of those topics as emergency items, those being water supply, the energy grid, and reducing property taxes. Lower ranked issues in the poll related to abortion services, school voucher programs, and more limits on cannabis products. Democratic voters specifically cared most about increasing access to health care, while Republicans cared most about enforcing immigration policies.
I find it really interesting specifically that, jumping back to the crypto reserve, that it would fall under the jurisdiction of the comptroller. That currently is Glenn Hagar, but rumor has it that he is on the short list to be in the next set of leadership at Texas A&M. So a lot that could happen there and a lot of developments in the legislature. Tower Talks will be off next week for spring break. When we are back, we'll have more great shows for you to close out the season. Be sure to follow us on social media at TSTV News on X, formerly Twitter, and at Tower Talks TSTV on Instagram. There you will be able to find out when our next episode will be in 2025 and the topics being covered. Check us out at tstvnews.com online and subscribe to our newsletter, Newsroom Notes. From all of us here in the studio, thank you for joining us this evening, and good night.